We start from a foundation. I think a lot of people in this room are already doing their work from the notion that when we're talking about stories, we're not just talking about describing the world in a better way, in getting our stories out there. We're also recognizing the true power of narrative. That we're narrative beings. That's what we are, narrative animals. That stories don't just aren't something we tell only. They're something that tell us. They're not just descriptive, they're generative. So, you look up here, the Big Dipper. Is there really a Big Dipper up in the sky?
No. Yes.
Maybe, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. In this configuration, anybody know any other names for this configuration?
Great Bear.
Great Bear?
Ursa Major.
I'm sure there's all sorts of names from different cultures all around the planet. So it doesn't necessarily, what this tells us that's a really important foundational place for working at narrative is that the currency of narrative is not truth. This is a common mistake that we at smartMeme see all the time with our brothers and sisters in activist movements. If we just tell people more urgently, more vehemently about the injustice, about the destruction, about the racism, we just tell them the facts. If they would just read my fact sheet, they would know. I'm seeing a lot of nods, a lot of smiles. So we know that that's not necessarily the problem, because the currency of narrative is meaning. It's not truth. So it's about actually creating meaning in the world, connecting with what is meaningful to folks. So that's why for smartMeme, as a movement support and strategy organization, we started working around narrative, because we felt like in so many of the movements that we were a part of, we were hitting similar glass ceilings, similar assumptions in the dominant culture that were preventing systemic change, preventing acknowledgement of the injustices that were happening, and that we needed better tools around narrative to do that. So, room full of organizers, let's make sure to ground it in these two big red concepts here. Read them for me.
Power, strategy.
So wherever we're going, whatever we're doing, looking at narrative, obviously when we say that narratives are generative and they create meaning for people, that means we've got to look at power, right? That means we've got to look at what are the power relationships that are inherent in those narratives. How do we balance the power that we're all trying to build, a collaborative power, a creative power, versus the coercive power and the divisive powers that are often used against our communities. And looking at narrative through the lens of strategy means story-based strategy, that this is really about our goals, our plans, how we're going to do it, and how does story fit into that. So a model of power here, very simple model of the carrot and the stick. Oftentimes we face both of these things, but I want to draw your attention to these pyramids down here. A lot of times the system, this pyramid is the status quo. So picture a bunch of elites up here calling the shots, and they're saying, we've got physical, economic power, we've got coercive power, we're going to send the cops into your community. Sure, you can try to start a union, but we're going to fire you as soon as you try. And they want us to believe that this is all very stable, that power comes from the top, that they've got the power, we don't. We all know from our work that actually the status quo is very unstable. It's actually an upside down pyramid, and it's propped up by all these different institutions that prevent change from happening. So what a narrative power analysis does is to add to that list of institutions that people are used to taking on, whether it's the police or the corporations or other forms of the state, to look at some of the stories, the narratives, the control mythologies that are preventing change from happening and are propping up the status quo. The big lies, if you will. America is the freest country in the world. You can't fight City Hall. Economic growth is the sole measure of human progress. Come on, hit me with some more. What are some of the control mythologies you all are facing in your work?
Humans are separate from nature.
Other ones?
You need money to do things.
You need money to do things?
Secret societies control everything, Illuminati.
Yep, there you go.
One person can't make a difference.
One person can make a difference. Yes.
Tina,
Unpack that for us.
there is no alternative.
Oh, that's kind of like the Uber control mythology, right? Many folks know the continent exercise. A lot of folks in this room. Some nods for those that don't play along. Who's got a definition of continent for me? Nothing super geological. What'd you learn? What's a continent?
large.
Body of water.
Surrounded by water. And how many are there?
7.
Seven. Right. Okay. So we're not going to get caught up in these. So we got Antarctica. That's 1, right? Count them with me. 2, 3. Over here. 4, 5, 6. Huh. Well, that doesn't seem to be that large. It sure doesn't seem to be surrounded by water. It actually looks like it's just a part of this one. So if culture is a shared map that we all have, there's folks drawing the map, right? We know that the map is not the territory. Why does Europe get to be a continent? Because they said so. Power, right? That's colonialism. That's white supremacy. That's imperialism. That's the history that we're inheriting, right? This is just one little snapshot of it. But the narrative realm, a lot of the stories that we've inherited, a lot of these control mythologies come directly out of the history of physical power relationships. So if we say with a narrative power analysis, because we experience the world through narrative, every power relationship out there has a narrative component. And of course, another cultural map here. You can shout these out for me. What do you see?
Malicious.
Go for it. Come on. What do you see? Don't be shy.
Lego.
Logo.
Oreos.
Frito-Lay.
So here we have some of the greatest storytelling minds of our generation are busy selling us cheap disposable plastic crap, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Reese's.
Yeah, there you go. See? Now let's remember, these aren't corporate logos. These are snippets of corporate font treatments.
Wow.
And think about how many more could you probably identify. So this is a cultural landscape that we're bombarded with, the hyper-consumerism. Did you ask to remember that information? Did you ask to be able to be like, I want to recognize the P and Pez for the rest of my life? I have an 11-year-old son, and he'd be super psyched for everyone who recognizes the Pez. Who can tell me a story? Tell me a story about this one.
Oreo.
Oreo.
Ice cold milk and an Oreo cookie.
There you go. Okay, how about this one?
It's hot.
Soup is good food.
Soup is good food. Where did that come from? $200 billion in the advertising industry bombarding us. This is what we mean by this geeky but common sense concept of the meme. How many folks are familiar with a meme? A few folks, great. So the technical definition of a meme, it comes from a rather problematic guy in the world of evolutionary biology named Richard Dawkins. And it's basically the notion of a gene of culture, a replicator, a way that culture spreads. At smartMeme, we're not so wedded to the sort of these different models, but we thought that it was a really useful way to talk about how stories spread and how power operates in the culture. And if you're going to talk about changing the culture, we need to have some analytical tools to look at it. So for us, this is the definition of a meme, a capsule for a story to spread. And a meme is a very broad concept. It's basically any idea or cultural practice that is replicated. So it could be exchanging rings, could be a symbol like the peace sign or the cross, could be our political slogans. Our movements are powerful creators of memes, whether it's green jobs or civil rights. Like, we're constantly having to create sort of packages for people to understand our messages and spread them. This is particularly important in the media environment that we work in today, where we all know that what's happening in the world can't be shortened to a little catchphrase that's going to be easily repeated, right? I mean, maybe some of you all are brilliant and can figure out how to do that, but in general, from smartMeme's perspective, we can't do that. But the reality is, it's going to happen. Our messages are going to be shortened. Our narratives are going to be encapsulated, and it becomes the question of power is who's going to do the encapsulating. Is it going to be us? Are we going to get to tell our own stories, or are people going to tell the stories about us? So a narrative power analysis, here's an example of some of the different questions. Basically, the methodology that smartMeme has used is to recognize on any issue that we're working on, just as we do the analysis, our movements have been so good at analyzing physical relationships of power, the economic and political decision-making processes, we need to do the same thing with the web of narrative that surrounds an issue. The first part is this key point of filters, sort of what we started with, is that the problem is not necessarily what people don't know. Ignorance is a huge problem, right? But a bigger problem is what people do know, because what people already know creates the filters that prevent them from hearing our messages, that literally make it impossible for them to believe, that what's happening on the other side of the tracks, or what's happening in another part of the world, or what's happening in their own community. So those filters are really key for understanding them. Examining the dominant stories in U.S. culture. Given the week that we're at, this seems like an appropriate one to look at. Who can tell me not the truth, mind you, but the story? What is this story right here, the Thanksgiving story? What's that story? Break it down for me.
Well, after successful pillaging of...
Now that may be the truth.
Thanksgiving was founded when the natives brought the pilgrims food.
There it
And
is.
they celebrated.
Yep.
Together.
Welcome to our
Together. Happily.
Welcome to our land. Let us show you some tips about how to grow the food here. Let's all live happily ever after. So, this represents a key point that's worth remembering, that we all know from being critics of U.S. history, but remembering in our everyday life that power shapes the point of view of the story. The pilgrim went on to kill all the other folks and take over the entire continent, and then took over the story, right? Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at a story, we have to constantly ask who has the point of view in the story, and what does that represent about power? Because many folks in this country will be having a beautiful, powerful family dinner this Thursday, and we'll be celebrating Thanksgiving. And then a number of folks all around the world, particularly indigenous communities, will be celebrating an International Day of Mourning for the genocide, and marking it. So, there's stories in the dominant culture are always contested, but figuring out how to change the point of view, because most importantly for the work that so many of us are doing here is to figuring out how to create space for change. We have to recognize how stories can normalize power, can universalize a certain experience. So for instance, how many folks here are working on migrant rights? Connecting that with your work these days? A few folks. So, this whole mythology that's there about the way that people came to this country, which is largely a mythology, but the way that European folks came, this story's out there. Is that the experience of people coming to this country now? But that story's there, so it provides these, this has been a huge struggle in the immigrant rights movement, right? Is how much to use this story, how much to pretend that the streets really were paved with gold and it used to be that much better, versus how much to come up against that. But that's what a narrative power analysis is about. So just a reminder that framing is about life and death, right? We all know that a word makes a big difference. This is a great example of a meme. The way that a frame goes viral, and that obviously the same activity here in people surviving Katrina can get packaged in very different ways. Loots versus fines. This story packages the whole history of criminalization and dehumanization that people of color face in this country for a long time. This story, it's those plucky white people. They're just out there surviving in the midst of it, making it happen. This one brings the National Guard to help you. This one brings the National Guard to shoot you. Framing is about life and death. I'm sure many folks have already seen these pictures. It was a great example of the definition of a frame, because a lot of times people get caught up in thinking that framing is really technical or difficult, or you somehow need to leave it to the experts. And the reality is you all are framing stuff all the time. This is a big frame in terms of a literal frame that so many of us have to work to overcome, which is the boundaries around the edge of the television screen. It's a screenshot from April 7, 2003. I'm sure many of us were busy trying to prevent this horrible invasion of Iraq at the time. But tell me, what's the story here? Not the truth again. What's the story? What do you see? Liberation. Who are these folks?
Grateful Iraqis.
The masses.
Thrilled to welcome the U.S. troops to pull down the statue of the evil dictator.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the way framing works. You see what's in the frame. You make meaning with what is in the frame. You understand it. This is the exact same picture, the same event, same time. That's the statue we were just looking at. That's the masses of Iraqi people. Remember, Baghdad's a city of 5 million people. These are U.S. tanks. This is a photo is from Reuters, taken from the Palestine Hotel, the one location where unembedded journalists were semi-safe. So, you change the frame. What do we see now? Who has the power in this picture? right? These old tanks. So when we expand the frame, when we make what has been invisible as visible, we change the meaning of it. That's what reframing is, and that's the work that social movements are always doing. How many folks, raise your hand if you've seen this picture before? Wow, constantly amazed. We always say we're going to retire this picture, and then after years of showing it, we still find people. This picture is seen all over the world. The only place this picture wasn't seen was inside the United States. And that's from Reuters. I mean, that's, for folks not familiar with Reuters, giant international wire service. So, the technical definition, the term frame comes from a sociologist in the 1970s, Irving Goffman, a schemata of interpretation. This is all kind of like geeky academic stuff, but the things that are most relevant of it for, I think, the purposes of a group and a project like this, where people are thinking, how can we connect our different struggles and our different work to tell stories into some new frames that are going to create meaning for people, that are going to open up some new political space. This concept of frame alignment, that a social movement really takes off when the frames that are coming out of our movements align with what people already have in their mind, their understanding of the world, right? We all know this from our organizing, because organizers invented all this shit, right? I mean, storytelling is at the center of organizing and movement building. These are the fancy words that the academics have put on it, but the thing that's most relevant here in terms of what framing really does, how do we create frames that can align with people's sense of possibility? Problem, solution, action. So this is the actual definition of a frame that smartMeme uses. The larger story that shapes understanding of information, experiences, and messages. The structure and boundaries of a narrative that defines point of view and power. Frames operate in pre-existing narrative lenses in our minds. This is really key because, as we've been saying over and over again, as people were saying that they experience, the frames always trump the facts. People's filters. People believe what they already believe. They believe more stuff like they already believe. This is a huge problem for those of us who are trying to push back on 500 years of conquest and colonization and try to do something different. We have to recognize that we have to find ways to align that. So here's just an example. An issue can be framed many different ways. These are all different frames from the climate movement. smartMeme has been doing a lot of work supporting the emerging climate justice movement. I'll highlight this one because this is something that Gopal was going to talk about, and we'll touch on a little bit in that section. Anybody here in Cochabamba in April for the People's Conference on Climate Change, the Rights of Mother Earth? This is a whole new exciting frame around climate change that has come out of social movements, particularly out of the Andean indigenous movements. The rights of Mother Earth. That is, there's a lot of different ways you can talk about climate change. Over there we have the science, we have the international humanitarian frame, we have those ever popular charismatic megafauna, the environmental justice frame of everyone's downstream, it's the whole fossil fuel chain. And then this is a new big frame that will be really rolling out in a few weeks in Cancun at the next round of UN talks. So we can talk a little bit more about that and some of the other pieces that are there. Buen Vivir, anybody? Buen Vivir, is that resonating on? Great. So we'll talk about that too. All right. So how do you make frames? How do you do an analysis of them? How do you change them? What does that look like? smartMeme's work has been to anchor that kind of abstract world of narrative analysis in the stuff that we're all good at every day. Everybody tells a great story at the bar or around the dinner table, around the water cooler. We're all storytellers. We tell them all the time. So we use a very simple model of storytelling and of the elements of story to look at how you analyze a frame and then how you intervene in a story. So conflict, no story, right? I mean, and this is good for us because we're often involved in conflict, right? Change naturally has a lot of conflict. The characters. Who gets to be the characters in the story? Are they going to get to speak for themselves? Are they going to be flattened and caricatured as a stereotype? Are they sympathetic to people? What is it that's going to make them sympathetic? So the characters, in many ways, the messenger is as important as the message. Because the messenger is how we're trained to believe messages. Particularly now when we're bombarded by messages all the time, we don't all just believe everything we read on the internet, right? We want to know, where's it from? Who's the messenger? Imagery, show don't tell. I know we got a lot of writers in the room. Who can break down show don't tell for me? Come on, don't be shy. Start.
Well, if you're writing fiction or screenwriting or writing that kind of narrative, you can't bore people by sort of telling them, here's the theme of my story and why it's important. You have to embody it in the action, in the characters, and what happens in things that are tangible, things that people can see and touch and feel and hear. William Carlos Williams, the poet, always said, "No ideas, but in things." If you're writing a poem and I say, "You are the object of my cathexis," that's not really very inspiring.
I don't know.
If I say, "I could drown in the blue sea of your eyes,"
Yeah.
that's an image that's tangible. You can feel it. It awakens sensations and feelings and emotions. And talk to me after this meeting is over, and we'll pursue this.
Goodness.
No, let's start taking this right into foreshadowing. Where's the story going? What's happening?
I think we experienced a little bit of that a minute ago.
We're constantly, our mind is trained to sort of make meaning and assume where things are going to go. And the control mythology of Tina, there is no alternative, came up earlier. This is a big one, and this is one of the system's ultimate gambles, right? Is to say we control the future. This is the way it is. The way it is the way it will always be, and we know that's not true. But this is oftentimes a place where our movements that are so in the trenches, busy trying to expose the daily oppression and injustice, it's sometimes hard to show what other options may be, to foreshadow a different outcome. And that doesn't mean that foreshadowing all has to be positive. I mean, I think one of the big things for folks who are dealing with just transition work and the ecological crisis writ large is apocalyptic narratives. Is like, how do we balance the tension between this shit is serious versus, wow, we better give people some positive options here. So foreshadowing. The most important piece of all of this, though, and that's why it's in red, is the underlying assumptions. Because assumptions are what you have to believe in order to believe the story is true. So this is back to the power piece. That's what creates the believable story, and that's what shapes whether or not the story is even going to be heard. So all of these elements are places that we can build stories around, also places that we can intervene in. Just to say that what we mean by story-based strategy is not, a lot of people think of storytelling and stuff just in terms of media work and be like, oh, we need to amplify the voices of great spokespeople. That can be an important piece of storytelling, but that's the smallest application of story, really. We think, at smartMeme, we think of media really as a tactic, whereas message is a strategy. And that's what connects the dots between a lot of stuff. This is an example, folks are probably familiar with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. They've had, yet again, an amazing, every time we show this slide, they've had another amazing recent victory. They just had another one last week because they do incredible organizing, and they're amazing folks at integrating story and have a lot to teach folks on that. But storytelling amplifies the voices of the most impacted. It's also at the center of organizing, right? People share their stories of what's happening in their communities. They build a common story together. That's what organizing is. They mobilize around a common goal. And stories are also a great way to deepen people's analysis and connect issues. So story-based strategy is really about looking at narrative as being at the center of social change strategy. This is the geeky chart version for people who like their social change theory in chart form. I will spare you the details. You can get this in smartMeme's book, or you can download it off our website. But probably for the purposes of just the conversation that we're all having here today, the large outside circles may be relevant here. In terms of once a constituency is organized over there, once a shared problem has been identified, people are already engaged in political work, then this momentum of doing a narrative power analysis, looking at what's the narrative power map, what are the stories we're trying to change, developing a strategy to change those. One of the main tools that are probably our most popular tool that gets used a lot of places is called the battle of the story, a simple way for folks to break down their issue and break down the issues that they're trying to change. With using those elements of story. Finally, taking action. Actually, none of this is about just having a great soundbite. This is all about how do you move this story in the world? How do you integrate it into your campaigning? How do you intervene? And finally, of course, reflection to figure out, what does that all look like? In the middle here, we have social movement building just to honor, because this is what social movements have always done, right? This is how things change in our society. So a word about those interventions, we've sort of been talking about how to tell a good story, but as I mentioned at the beginning, the point here is we're trying to change those stories. We're trying to go at those control mythologies This is just one example of a reframing action. Folks finding an assumption within the issue they were working on and intervening to change it. This is some work that smartMeme supported with Iraq Veterans Against the War. We have any Iraq Veterans Against the War? But great action, amazing to folks. Maybe some folks here supported it, really spread one of the things. This is Operation First Casualty. What's the first casualty of war? Truth. So the whole issue here, when we did a survey strategy process with IBAW, we recognized the big framing battle for them, this is about 4 years ago, was that it was being called a war by the Bush administration, whereas they were pointing out it is an occupation. You know, and the whole right-wing narrative around it's a war. America doesn't lose wars. We don't cut and run. Remember all those Bush-era memes? And them explaining that from their lived experience there, it's an occupation. It's actually fueling the violence. So this is a piece of invisible theater that they put together where they basically reenacted what they were doing on an average day in Baghdad or other places in Iraq, and did it in iconic locations like the Capitol, like Times Square, so that people could see, wow, if that was happening in my neighborhood, how would myself and my neighbors respond? We wouldn't feel so peaceful. You know, that might not be like, you know, bringing things to a close here. So that was an effort to make the invisible visible. That was a larger strategy of vets as a sympathetic character who could talk about their real life experience, as they call it, boots on the ground perspective versus the politicians who were saying it was war. Finally, just to echo the urgency that I know so many of us here feel about this stuff, and why it's so important that meetings like this are happening and the work that you all are doing is happening, is that our movements really need to innovate around the power of narrative and the power of story. Our belief at smartMeme is that it's really one of the central mechanisms of control that the elites have mastered across the board. And it's one of the key things preventing change. And that it's incredibly important now as we see the ecological crisis really starting to become more visible. We talk about this as a slow motion apocalypse. Not apocalypse in the Christian sense of the end of the world, but apocalypse in the original meaning of the term, of a revelation or a lifting of the veil. And that's really what a lot of these ecospasms and other crises are doing, is they're showing folks that the world maybe isn't the way that they thought it was. Folks who had a little bit of privilege before are maybe starting to be like, wow, I didn't know this is how the system worked. You know, so when a Katrina happens, or a 9/11, or a BP Gulf oil disaster, all of these things cause massive destruction to homes, communities, lives, but they also cause massive destructions to people's assumptions. They create psychic breaks or openings in the narrative where folks can suddenly see a new story, see a new possibility. And this is incredibly dangerous, because if our movements aren't there to help people tell a new story and help people feel their own power, we know what the default settings are in this culture, right? The stories of fear, the racism, the sexism, the homophobia. Some of the work that smartMeme has been doing with Movement Generation and other folks in the climate justice movement has been looking at some of these big stories and assumptions that have to be changed. So these are ones specific to the climate discourse, but I'm sure folks will recognize them as them playing out all the place. The market will save us. It's a huge one. Each of these, I should say, in the interest of time, I won't explain the slides to you, but each of them has both the sort of the mythology and then people actually taking action to change it. So the market, that's a huge story that's rippling through the climate movement, right? And I'm sure people are facing that in other places. Right here, this was in the paper today. It's in the paper pretty much every day, something like this. This is a big advertisement from a car company that says, can a car company save the planet? The answer is no. They then go on to explain that actually the answer is yes, which is what increasingly I think we're all seeing corporate America doing, that this awareness around the ecological crisis is becoming bigger and bigger, and their common narrative that they all reinforce at every corporation, every ad out there, the market is the only thing that will save. Technology. This is some stuff around work that has been happening in the climate movement around geoengineering. The entire story of technology is the measure of progress. I'm sure people see that ripple out. Can be very controversial in certain circles of the ecological movement about what are appropriate technologies, what are not. But in general, compared to other aspects of our narrative, technology is the place that we don't necessarily have shared assumptions. We haven't built cultural mandates around that. Across the broader progressive movement, who are maybe one step away from climate or ecology, there's a lot of different opinions about technology. And finally, perhaps most importantly, this is a huge one for the UN process, is that the problem is so big, it doesn't matter what anybody does, only the governments can save us. So that's been a huge issue with, as the UN has started to look more and more like the World Trade Organization, it's been more and more difficult to try to challenge that and say, this whole process has been corrupted, but it's not the WTO. We can't just make it go away because there is, in fact, really, as we all know, a climate crisis. So big challenge, but to open up that space and to make visible the incredible work that's been happening in the grassroots environmental justice movement, in local transition work, all the work that folks here are involved in, that's all a piece of it. The governments aren't going to save us on this one. Sure, we need them to do some stuff, but to bring in the full frame of work that's happening around that. All of these are resources, tools, open source for the movement. So please take them, use them, make them better, send them back to us better. That's what we always ask.